Welcome to week 3, part 1. This week we're going to talk about creating inevitability. Great news. Now that we've established our setup, our propelling event, escalation, and our climax, we've created nearly all of the 5 essential elements of our story. Yoo-hoo! That's great! This week we're going to read Flight by Tessa Hadley. That was written in 2015. Wonderful story. We're going to write our resolution, which will provide that satisfying ending to our story, the 5th element in our essential elements of the short story. It's really the arrow in the bullseye because it's really your ending. And this is worth celebrating, which we'll do. We're going to revisit our story arcs so that we can understand how that resolution reinforces our character's after state of mind. Remember, by the time we get to the resolution, we'll have gone through before and we'll need to end up in the after frame of mind. We'll also create an ending that is inevitable. That was meant to be, and we'll do that through a little bit of foreshadowing, but that's later in the week. For right now, though, let's move to our resolution. Okay, resolution. It's really interesting. In French, people call the resolution of a story the denouement, okay, which is a fancy French word and means nothing more fancy than tying up the loose ends of the knot, like this big knot that you see right here on the right. The resolution coalesces all that's happened in your story. It brings it together, full circle. Your climax has kind of resolved that escalating track of incidents that, lead you to the highest point in your story arc, but your resolution is part of the falling action. It's sort of like the exhalation of your story. We've been breathing in because we're real excited, but then we can finally exhale after the resolution, and it's a beautiful moment. The resolution brings us full circle to the after, which again should be very, very different from the before. And this way the reader can celebrate that with you because the reader has been part of your journey from the beginning. The resolution touches on the consequences for our character after the story. Look at the resolution and reunion. It's really simple because this is a short story. It's not even 1,200 words, but Cheever is able to pack so much into this story. And he does it with the very last line of the story. And he says, "Goodbye, Daddy," I said, and I went down the stairs and I got my train, and that was the last time I saw my father. His father had just insulted yet one more person, the clerk at the newsstand, and that was enough for Charlie. He doesn't say goodbye, Father. He says goodbye, Daddy, which pretty much tells the reader that their relationship has exploded. It's never going to be resolved after this. It's satisfying to the reader in that even though it's a sad ending, Charlie's growing up. He's learned a bitter lesson early in life, and a lot of children unfortunately have to learn that. But he's going to be better for this because his father right now, in the beginning he says he's my future and my doom. Well, if he became an alcoholic like his father, he could very well end up in the same place. And I think Charlie is going to chart a new course for his life, a different course at least. And that's good news. Let's look at the story arc here. The story arc, you can see that with reunion, we've been through 1, 2, 3, and 4, the climax when the pattern's broken when Charlie remembers his train. That's not the end of the story. It could be the end of the story, but it'd be a little unsatisfying. The resolution to the story is to see that his father is not going to change. His father has insulted all the waiters and restaurant staff that he can, so he's going to insult a newsstand clerk, and he's going to do it in front of the world. And Charlie sees it, and that's all he needs to see to say, "Goodbye, Daddy." So the before, Charlie is happy and excited to see his father, and that's at the setup phase. But by the time we get to number 5 in our story arc, Charlie knows he will never see his father again. He essentially grows up. This is good news. The readers said, "Finally, Charlie, you've seen this." Charlie knows it, and it's a lot better, a lot more satisfying. Let's look at the resolution in everyday use. It's a beautiful, another last sentence. After we watched the car dust settle, I asked Maggie to bring me a dip of snuff. And then the 2 of us just sat there enjoying until it was time to go into the house and go to bed. This is beautiful. And if you'll remember, Maggie had a little bit of snuff in the beginning. So what's really interesting, this resolution brings us full circle. They're both going to have a little bit of snuff. They're both going to sit there. They're going to watch the car dust settle, and the dust and the clay. That was one of the things that may have been in Alice Walker's treasure chest, because she's going to bring that back in the end. And Dee is like a big dust cloud. It's going to settle in eventually. And now Mama's before is going to, her after is going to be much different from her before. Let's look at that. The 5 elements of the story arc in everyday use is like this. We have before, Mama admires Dee. Okay, after the escalation of incidents, from the butter churn to the quilts to when Mama takes them back in the climax, now she asks Maggie to bring her a dip of snuff. Dee is gone. Before, Mother admired Dee and fantasized about them being on Johnny Carson together. After, Mother admires Maggie. Okay, they're going to have an even deeper and more fulfilling relationship now, because she knows that Maggie has a lot more characteristics inside her to admire. Maggie's a little bit more like Mama. She's good around the house. She knows what to do. She's practical minded, and she appreciates the simpler things for what they are. And this is a wonderful conclusion to that story. Let's look at, now we'll look at our third story, which you'll be reading this week. So I hope there's no spoiler alerts here, but there's no spoiling here. Here's your alert if you haven't read it. But the resolution in Flight, she ends on some beautiful sensory images, the feeling of that scarf around her neck. Look, Claire had to laugh, when her sister packed the scarf back in her bag without her knowing about it. It was a comical moment, because I felt with Claire as the reader, what else could she have done? She'd done everything. Susan may or may not forgive her. She's probably not going to forgive her, but she can laugh and she can appreciate the fluidity of that beautiful scarf and how it felt, the coolness around her neck. She's feeling a lot better now, because what else can she do? She's done all she can do. The reader is satisfied she had done that too. And, if she hadn't done all she could do, we wouldn't be at the same place. So if we look at the story arc in Flight, we can see, okay, from the setup, she's flying against the setting sun. That was a little bit of foreshadowing to us, but there's her setup. She feels adrift between the U.S. and the U.K., her home, okay? But once we go through the escalation, the climax, now that we're at the resolution, Claire resolves. She doesn't feel as adrift right now. She's going to go back to her new home in the United States. Yes, it turns out she was the rebel, not Susan, but she's going to make peace with a coworker. They had an unfortunate incident there before she left, but she's going to have to deal with that, and she's going to have to deal with the issues there. She's going to be happier because she's done all she can do to make her sister want to be reunited as a family, and she can't. She spent some quality time with her niece and her the baby, but what else can she do? She had the visit back to Britain, had a nice resolution for it, and we know that Claire is going to move on. She's decided to push that sorrow down and bury it. And this is what a lot of us have to do. Therapists would say you shouldn't bury any sorrow, but we all have some things that we just have to go on, and sometimes in life, as Claire did, we just have to laugh, and that's a beautiful moment, isn't it? Okay, how to create a resolution that resonates. What do you do? How do you do this? You've got to create a resolution that resonated just as much as the 3 that we just spoke about. One thing you can do is to go back and reread the beginning of your story, because the hints might be there, okay? Claire bought the scarf earlier, and it wasn't the very beginning, but she bought it earlier in the story, and we came back to that. And that's one thing you can do too, is look at the beginning and look at your story worksheet, look at your treasure chest. What have you buried there? Think of your beginning and ending as mirrors hanging on opposite walls. Hannah Tinty from One Story, the editor that I learned this 5-element approach to the short story, she said that, and I really like that. You're tilting those 2 mirrors towards each other until they create the illusion of infinity like this. That's infinity. That's inevitability, as if it was meant to be. Remember what our friend K.M. Weiland said in our very first lesson? The thing your character needs usually won't be something physical, although it can and usually should take on a physical or visual manifestation by the end of the story. Remember, your readers are all about the senses, and they're all about wanting to feel what you feel as the writer. And Charlie's words, "Goodbye, Daddy," Maggie's smile, and Claire's delight in the sensory feel of that scarf are perfect examples of what K.M. meant by a physical manifestation. And it's so much better to end on something simple and not conclude your story by saying, so this is how Claire felt, or, Charlie, next step, he went back to the Arondikes and talked about it with his mom. It's so much better for him to say goodbye, Daddy, and go on down and get his train. That's beautiful, and that allows a little bit of nuance and allows the reader to fill in the blanks, because chances are your reader is smarter than you know. Okay, some tips here. Circle back to your setting. Go back to your physical setting. You may have something there that can work. Don't end too soon. The tone you're ending should be a slow goodbye, like when you're hugging your friend goodbye and you hold that final hug a little bit longer just because you're sad and you don't want to see him go. You're happy in a way because you're happy with the story is over, but you want to prolong those good feelings, those endorphins in your brain. Focus on the final meaning, what you want your reader to remember. Now, we'll talk about this in next week's lesson, so don't worry too much about it. But go back to your premise of your story, because I bet there's a nice nugget hidden there, because this is what got you excited about your story in the first place. So go back there. Also, use the five senses. A lot of what Tessa Hadley does in Flight, she refers to the feel of the scarf, the colors, the sight, how it feels, the coolness of it around her neck. I mean, all those things help the reader put themselves in your shoes, right? They can experience the situation alongside the character. Again, it prolongs that journey. We've been part of our character's success or their growth in Charlie's case, and so let's prolong it a little bit through the sensory senses that we have there. End on a physical gesture or a bit of dialogue, such as a reunion when Charlie says goodbye, Daddy, and he goes down a flight of steps to get his train. Always end on something physical when you're in. I think it's just a way to end any kind of story. I like to end my essays that way. It's just a nice note of finality that transports the reader into your world. Give a hint of the future, how things have changed for your character. Remember, for number 5 and 6 in that list above, look at this from everyday use. Maggie smiled, maybe at the sunglasses. Dee was wearing sunglasses, but a real smile, not scared. After we watched the car dust settle, I asked Maggie to bring me a dip of snuff. And then the two of us just sat there, just enjoying until it was time to go back into the house and go to bed. These are those two things, end on a physical gesture or a bit of dialogue. Give a hint of the future. We know that this is what their life is going to be like after this, and this is wonderful after the dust of Dee settled back. Okay, now, week 3, part 1. This are all the things we need to be doing at this point. Okay, you need to read Flight if you haven't. That story is a little more complicated than the 2 previous stories, than Reunion and Everyday Use, and it's more contemporary in the sense that it's the kind of story that's being written today, and it has an escalation in there. It's a little more subtler than the other 2, but it's every bit as dramatic, and the ending is every bit the resolving moment as the others. So this is the great thing about reading that story. I want you to picture your story arc so you can see in your story. You can actually draw it out and make sure all your pieces are there, especially as you prepare to write your resolution. Your climax is the highest plot point. It's the most dramatic. Your resolution cannot be that dramatic. You can have a touch of humor. You can do some funnier things in there, but it can't be as dramatic because your reader is on the exhale moment, It's like we're at cruising altitude. If you're on a plane right now, it's when, we're getting ready we've gone up, the takeoff has happened, we're at cruising altitude, or we're just getting ready to land maybe. You really can't introduce new pieces there. You need to be working on your final 1,000 words of your story, because this week we're actually going to finish our first draft. So for part 1 of week 3, you might be working on that a little bit so you're not stuck writing a lot of it at the last minute. Maybe you have a lot right now. That's what we're going to do. And then I want to end on a little bit of inspiration, which I think is beautiful. It's a thought by Haruki Murakami, and they say, my short stories are like soft shadows I have set out in the world, faint footprints I have left. I remember exactly where I set down each and every one of them and how I felt when I did. Short stories are like guideposts to my heart. I hope this helps you a little bit as you write your story and you think about the resolution. There's a little bit of you in this story. There has to be. It doesn't matter what kind of character you have, how different they are, and where they're coming from. But to truly connect with your readers, you're going to need to give a little bit of yourself in that story. And this is what's really wonderful about being a fiction writer, is you can be anywhere. You can be anybody. Alice Walker has said that. D.H. Lawrence have said that. I can be anybody when I'm writing. And it holds true for you. So have fun And I'll see you again in part 2, and we'll conclude the end of week 3.